Once again, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I'm Abby Fenwald. I'm the events assistant here. And this evening, we're so pleased to welcome Dr. Alan Gregerman to discuss his book, Necessity of Strangers, which he just told me was a Washington Post bestseller this week. So, fantastic news. So you may be familiar with his work as he's a well-known expert on strategy and innovation and is President and Chief Innovation Officer, is that the right title? Of VentureWorks, Inc., a consulting company right in town here that works with a variety of businesses to develop new ways of serving their customers. So in his latest book, Dr. Gregerman explores the value of reaching out to people outside of our circle of friends, family, and colleagues to provide a fresh perspective and help us reach our full potential. So this book really can change the way we think about connecting to others, and we're really pleased that he is here with us this evening to tell us all about it. So please join me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
I think I'll stop. Great. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm delighted you're all here on a rainy day, but I guess rain is better than the weather we've had before. I'm delighted that you're all here as well on a night when March Madness is going on. I'm assuming some people I don't see with their significant others. Those folks are watching basketball. It's possible. And I know there are a few people here who are Wisconsin fans, so we'll try and make this wrap up in time for the Wisconsin game. So I'm delighted to be here at Politics and Prose. This is the third time. It kind of coincides with the third book that I've written that's been in bookstores, and it's always been kind of a great experience. It's a wonderful kind of venue and kind of one of the great bookstores in America, so we're lucky that it's here in the Washington, D.C. area. And I'm delighted to talk about my new book, The Necessity of Strangers, which you've seen out there, but it looks like this, and I have to admit, in the short time it's come out, it's become one of my favorite books, actually. And not only, I mean, I'm hoping all of you will buy it and read it, and I'm also hoping if you decide to read it, that you're willing to read it in an area of really high visibility. You'll notice a few of our kids, actually all of our kids, are wearing these t-shirts that we've made that have the book cover on the back, and on the front of the book cover it says "Friends are overrated." And if you read it in an area of high visibility and send me a picture of you doing that, I will and your shirt size, I will gladly send you one of these shirts so that you can alienate all of your friends as you meet new people. As Abby mentioned, this new book is really about the importance of strangers in our lives and in the lives of the companies and organizations we work for. I spend most of my work time helping companies and organizations to think in new ways and to create, hopefully, compelling value for the customers they have the privilege to serve. And as I do this, I'm always challenged by thinking about how we actually can come up with new ideas. And I'm always challenged to get organizations to realize that the people who are in them are often really wonderful people, and that our friends are typically really, really wonderful people. And I don't want to alienate because I have a lot of friends here tonight. But the reality is, in some important ways, friends can only get us so far. Because research suggests that friends are actually a lot like us. They tend to have roughly the same education level as us. There are more chairs wherever you'd like. They tend to have roughly the same education level as us. They tend to work in jobs that are kind of in some way comparable to us. They kind of live in roughly the same places as us. Strangely enough, they often have roughly the same hobbies as us. And when it comes time for us to break out of the mold to do something, they're way more likely to agree with us or tell us we got it kind of under control already than people who are total strangers, and especially people who are strangers from different walks of life and who have very different perspectives about things. And yet we live in a really friend-centric world. How many of you, in addition to my wife Lisa, are on Facebook? Any of you? Okay, so a few of you are on Facebook, actually most of you, and how many of you are on LinkedIn? Okay, and so all of you are doing a really good job to collect as many friends as you can. You know, people you're connected with who can help you in some way. And it's based on a notion that we have that it's who, or I should be corrected by our daughter who's better at English, she said who or whom you know that matters most, okay? I'd like to challenge you to think that it's actually whom you could know that matters way more than whom you know, even when you know some awesome people. I'd like you also to think about that even if you're awesomely well connected and you have 500 or even 1,000 Facebook friends or LinkedIn contacts, that pales in significance to the 7.1 billion people on the planet. And so if we were to simply do the math, you basically know no one, okay? Which is okay, which is actually a huge upside for all of us, because we all have the power actually to connect with literally anyone on the planet if we challenge ourselves to do it, to get out of the comfortable confines of the folks we know best and to stretch to connect with people who in some significant way are very different than us. We can do that online, we can do that walking down the street, we can do that by being open to going to a book talk or a lecture or something that pushes us to think about new subjects or new ways of thinking about the things that matter most to us. And I'd also argue that whether we like to think about it or not, because we've been conditioned since youth to believe that strangers are folks to fear, or at least to avoid, that most of us end up finding our closest friends or our lifelong partners from the ranks of strangers. That most of us end up deciding what career to pursue or what college to go to based on the insight of people that at one point we never knew. That most of us now make travel plans based on a huge community of total strangers who are kind enough to write down what they think on TripAdvisor. And that has replaced kind of travel agents, the trusted travel agent who was our friend, and that all of us in a time of great need, when we face an emergency or a medical emergency possibly, rely on the expertise of strangers, folks who often we didn't know. So strangers are actually pretty important, and I'd love to challenge all of you to spend a little bit of time, not during the session, but at some point after, thinking about all the strangers who've had a compellingly powerful role in your life. There are a few seats up here for those of you, unless you like to stand, there are more seats up here. These are actually really good seats. I'll be doing some scientific experiments in a little while. So I want to challenge you simply to think about the reality that our ability to connect what we know with what people from all different walks of life know or from all different corners of the world is what's really going to make us way more remarkable in reaching our potential. And I'd love to begin by sharing a few ideas. So as a child, I absolutely was amazed by helicopters, and I would stare at them whenever they went by. And so I sought to figure out the history of the helicopter. I found that the helicopter was in fact invented, kind of, sort of, or commercialized by a guy named Igor Sikorsky, a Russian immigrant to the United States. And in 1939, after years of thinking about vertical flight, he launched the VS-300, the world's first vertical flight craft. And it flew on its maiden flight for 59 minutes. Absolutely awesome. Imagine that. So he tested and worked on things, never flown it, and then it flew for 59 minutes. One might have imagined that this was a work of a lone genius or a genius surrounded by a few folks, but if one had had the chance to talk to Sikorsky, you would have learned that he actually was inspired by 2,000 years of strangers, 2,000 years of vertical flight. Now you're thinking to yourself, helicopters 2,000 years ago, but in fact in the markets of Europe where Sikorsky was a child, there's seats here and they're good seats.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Welcome. Sikorsky saw this toy, simply called the Chinese Tom. It was a toy that had been invented 2,000 years ago. The original Chinese tops were made out of wood. This one is now made out of plastic, and not coincidentally, it's made in China. And so Sikorsky was fascinated by the fact that he could literally play with a helicopter that people had conceived of a long time ago. Sorry. I guess I was supposed to stay by the podium. Am I messing you guys up here? Okay. Okay. Let me put it here because I'll have another use for that side in a second. Okay. Is that better? Okay, good. So Sikorsky was absolutely fascinated by that notion from the time he was a child. Now, Sikorsky then committed to studying everything that other folks knew about vertical flight. And he found out about a guy who was semi-clever named Leonardo da Vinci, okay? And by all accounts, he was a Renaissance man. He had an advantage over the rest of us because he actually lived during the Renaissance. So Da Vinci had actually drawn pictures of something that looked like a helicopter. If you Google Leonardo da Vinci helicopter, you'll see this kind of cool contraption that was meant to send people straight up in the air. It required a bunch of people on the ground actually turning things that would get people up in the air. But he was fascinated by that. Genius, yes. Strangers important to him? Absolutely. In fact, outside his balcony in Florence, Da Vinci saw these guys, the living embodiment of helicopters, known as dragonflies. An amazing creature that had an unbelievable ability to go straight up in the air, go straight forward, just hang out there for a while, come down onto a lily pad, hover for a while, then go up and then go backwards as fast as it could go forward, something actually a modern helicopter is incapable of doing. And Da Vinci imagined in looking at dragonflies that in fact humans could do the exact same thing. So everyone who had imagined helicopters had been building on the ideas of others. So when Sikorsky finally launched his helicopter, while it was safe to say he was a smart guy, it was even safer to say that in the absence of strangers, he would have never made it happen. Well, a bunch of you probably say, well, you know, that's all well and good, but aren't there most of these really creative companies are companies that in fact don't need strangers? They hang out in really smart people places like Cupertino, California, and just come up with really clever ideas, okay? And one you might instantly think about is the Apple company. And how many of you here were in Washington, so you're a pretty kind of cool group, have an Apple product? Any of you have Apple products, okay? And how many of you have an Apple portable music player, okay? Okay, and so you're among the 72% of folks in the world because that's their market share of digital music players, 72%. And so you might say, God, these folks are so brilliant, they figured it out themselves. And yet I'd argue that the Apple iPod and the whole ecosystem that supports it is one big knockoff that was cleverly kind of developed and adapted by a bunch of really clever people. So that's why I needed this side of me. So let me kind of give you a sense of what I mean. Some of you are jealous, I know, already. So it's 1979 as I walk across the Diag at the University of Michigan. I am the coolest person on campus because unlike anyone else, I have entertainment that is portable. I am the proud possessor of a Sony Walkman, a marvel at the time of modern technology. This is actually a really cool one. This is the waterproof version, and in fact it was for about 30 seconds. But unlike everybody else there, I can take my music with me in multiples of 12 songs. Is that awesome? I simply put a cassette in there and I am ready to go. Wait a minute. Pink Floyd, this is really good. I was literally a party waiting to happen, actually. The only trouble in that day was all earphones were connected, so I couldn't simply hand an earphone to somebody else, and then I think they've come to take this device from me, actually. So Apple didn't invent the idea of portable music. The folks at Sony did in 1979. Apple came up with a cooler way to kind of think about it, and if I actually think about, let's see, here, if I decide to unplug from these 12 songs, I can plug this in here, and on here I have 3,200 songs. So that's kind of cool. So they figured that out. But they didn't even invent the technology that supports these products. That's MP3 technology, and that was invented in 1986 by 2 German engineers. And the reality is, one might even argue that the heart of what makes Apple so sticky for all of us is the iTunes Store, the world's largest repository of digital content anywhere in the world. 2,300-year-old idea. In fact, the Egyptians invented the idea of bringing everybody's content together with a great library in Alexandria. 2,300 years ago, in this amazing library, the Egyptians had brought together 400,000 parchment documents. So imagine that, 400,000 handwritten documents. What they believed at the time was close to the sum total of human knowledge. Now granted, they hadn't been everywhere, and they didn't know a lot about a lot of places, but their notion that if we bring all this knowledge together, it's powerful, was a notion that folks like Apple use today. So the most remarkable companies with the most remarkable ideas tend to still rely on the power of strangers. One might even imagine that Steve Jobs, because he mentioned it, when he was interviewed for his book, knew something that another really clever guy named Vidal Sassoon knew. So how many of you remember, a bunch of you probably don't, a haircut that was all the rage called the bob when the Beatles landed in America, okay, 50 years ago? It was invented by a guy named Vidal Sassoon, a hairdresser in London. A hairdresser who thought that hairdressing needed a major makeover. And so he could have turned to other hairdressers to figure out how to create women's hairstyles that were simple, easy, and elegant. But instead he decided to look for inspiration elsewhere. And he found it in Bauhaus architecture. His inspiration for this hairstyle were these buildings. And he went to Tel Aviv in Israel, where the largest collection of these buildings are, and studied them and took detailed notes, and on the side of those notes drew detailed pictures of what women's hair might look like. Now, I mentioned this as well because in the book Steve Jobs, he cites that when he came up with the first Mac computer, he was inspired by Bauhaus architects. He was inspired by something that could be clean, simple, easy, and functional as a key ingredient of any product that Apple should make. So the reality is that everyone who creates something meaningful relies in some way on strangers. But that's not how generally in organizations innovation works. Typically what happens is this. In any of your organizations, you need to come up with a better idea. You need to be more brilliant. So at the appointed time, you or the person in charge of coming up with a brilliant idea gathers your smartest people in a room and then turns to all of them and says, you know, our backs are to the wall. Our budgets are cut. We have new competitors. The customers aren't as excited about what we do. We need to do better. Does anybody have an out-of-the-box idea? Has anybody ever been in a meeting like that? Has anybody ever led a meeting like that, Peter? No. And then suddenly, at that moment, everybody in the room raises their hands, makes cool noises like a seal, ooh, 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 as though they have a brilliant idea, right? No. Silence fills the room. And everybody looks for a reason to get out of the meeting. So they look at their smartphones, which they've cleverly turned off. Oh my gosh, a customer has called me, I must leave. But you guys are so smart, you'll do a great job. I have faith in you. Because the reality is that just asking people to use a part of their brain they never use doesn't make it happen. And so we all sit there wondering, God, how will we ever come up with something brilliant? And yet it doesn't have to be that way if we understood one fundamental fact about new ideas and innovation. And it's a really cool and liberating fact. So let me ask you this. How many of you think of yourselves as being particularly innovative? Thank you for being here, at least this side of the room. Okay. So now let me give you a fact and then I'll ask the same question. 99% of all new ideas are based on the ideas of somebody else or something else. Okay? So if you suddenly knew that only 1% of all new ideas are based on original thinking and that 99% of ideas are based on somebody else's thinking, then it's pretty easy to be innovative. All we have to do is leave the meeting and actually wander around the world in search of ideas and inspiration. That's all we have to do. And yet we sit there racking our brains until they explode, when we could simply go out and find brilliance in the world around us. Now, part of the reason we don't do that is because we absolutely don't believe that strangers can help us generally. And we absolutely believe that we're way smarter than any other strangers on earth. And we do that because we've made a huge investment in our education and how we work and the way that we do things. So let me ask you, anybody here ever, other than our kids, but you guys can answer too, been a competitive swimmer? Anyone? Okay, and you know that you guys can share the answer here. So you guys know in every swimming meet held, whether it's the Montgomery County, Maryland Swim League, or the University of Virginia swim team, or the Australian national swim team, or the Olympics, that there are 4 strokes used in swim competition, and those are?
Butterfly, back, and free.
Okay. Okay, so they're the butterfly,
Breaststroke,
backstroke, and freestyle. Okay, and the fastest of those strokes is? Okay, the freestyle. Okay, good. And the second fastest, I don't want to, you just don't want to swim where there's a podium. Okay, good. The second fastest of those strokes is?
But it's fly for a while.
Okay, the butterfly, and there's reason to believe for like 18 to 20 meters that a good butterfly is actually faster than a freestyler. The third fastest of those strokes is the backstroke. Okay, and the slowest stroke used in competition is the breaststroke. Okay, it's kind of a funky stroke. You displace a lot of water. You can see where you're going, which is cool. The kick patterned after a frog, not quite as fast as a dolphin. Okay, it's a favorite stroke of 90-year-old German women in the Baltic Sea. Okay. Now, why do I inquire about swimming? Well, it turns out in the 1800s, there was only one place on Earth where they cared about competitive swimming, and that was Northern Europe. And whenever the water got warm enough, about 51 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius, they would hold a swim meet. And all the leading swimmers from Northern Europe would come. They'd come from Germany and Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg. I don't want to forget them. They might have a swimmer. And the Nordic countries, and they would come from the British Isles and France and Spain, and they'd gather for a swim meet. So it's 1844, and all the leading swimmers in Europe have gathered at a lake in London for a big swim meet. I should mention to you that in the 1800s, the only swim stroke that Northern Europeans had figured out how to swim was the breaststroke, the slowest stroke known to human beings. So the meet's about to begin, and just as it's about to begin, two visitors show up. They happen to be from South America. They'd never been to a swim meet, but they loved to swim. Having heard that people were swimming at a lake, they asked if they could participate. So let's get in the mood for a swim meet. Got my really stylish kind of racing goggles here, kind of like they might have worn in 1844. So let's get these guys on. Okay, good. So the swim meet's about to begin. These guests arrive, and they say to their hosts, you know, is it possible for us to participate? The host said, that'd be awesome. And so they say, great, just tell us what to do. And they say, it's really very simple. There's not that much to it. At an appointed time, the referee's going to say, swimmers, take your mark. Our swimmers are going to get down kind of like this. They'll probably take their Walkman off because that's a nuisance. But it's true. Maybe the music will help them go faster. They'll get down like this. Okay, you don't have to. A referee will point a gun. Don't worry, it's a blank. He'll fire it in the air. And then the race begins. You'll swim to the marker in the lake, and then you'll turn around and come back. The first person to touch the bank will be declared the winner. They said that sounded fine. Still not keen on the gun part, but that was okay. Swimmers, take your mark. The visitors looked down the row. Everyone got down. They decided that was cool. That's where the similarity would end. The gun went off. And within a few seconds, it was clear that these people had no idea, bless their hearts, how to swim the breaststroke, the slowest stroke known to human beings. Because within a few seconds, they were already ahead. On the bank, suddenly the crowd was silent. What in the world are these people doing? Then fear that they might sink. How can a human stay on the water like that? They'll never continue with the race. Turns out, bless their heart, they were swimming a variation of the freestyle, the fastest stroke known to human beings. At the halfway point, they were way ahead. The host said, oh my God, that's the weirdest thing I've ever seen people do on water. I don't understand who invented that or why they would ever do that. And then at the end of the first race, they were twice as far ahead. At the end of the first race, the host looked at them and said, you know, you guys must be really tired. Why don't you take a break, swim another race if you want to, and we'll see how it goes. To which the visitors said, well, actually, we're not tired at all. This was a lot of fun. If you don't mind, we'll just keep swimming. They won every single race. At the end of the meet, one might have imagined that the host, having seen a better way to swim, might have given the medals to these folks, told them how wonderful they were, then asked them if they could stay to teach them how to swim this new stroke. But instead, they wished them well, sent them on their way, and huddled on the side of the lake, determined to figure out how to swim the breaststroke faster. So that next time these people came, they would kick their butts. Okay. This went on for 29 years. For the next 29 years, Northern Europeans worked as hard as they could, regularly bringing the best swimmers together to figure out how to swim the breaststroke faster, so that the next time people came from another place, they could win the race. Then, in 1873, a young man named John Trudgeon became the coach of a leading London swim club. He had never seen anyone swim the freestyle, but having heard of an older member of the club who'd said that one day these people came from a distant land and swam super fast, he said, if there's a faster way to swim, I would like to learn it. What was he smoking? Maybe he was from Colorado. He went to South America to find these people. Now their swimming career had ended, but he found that everybody there swam a variation of the freestyle. He stayed there till he mastered the stroke, drew detailed pictures of everything they did, pictures that are now in a museum in London. And then he went home and taught his young charges how to swim the freestyle. At the first meet they entered, they won every single race. Now, Northern Europeans, having seen other Northern Europeans swimming the freestyle, decided this was cool, and the world of swimming was changed forever. The most exciting fact about the history of swim strokes is the following. We now know in every corner of the world except Northern Europe, in the Americas, in Africa, in South Asia, East Asia, Australia, and the islands of the Pacific, people have been swimming a variation of the freestyle for 10,000 years. So the only place on earth where they cared about competitive swimming was the only place they had no idea how to swim fast. So I mention this story often because I believe that in some way all of us swim regularly our variation of the breaststroke. I believe we go to work each day trying to do the best we can with the way we've been trained to do the stuff we do. I believe that we are so excited about the breaststroke that when there's an opportunity to innovate, we believe that the best way is by making incremental changes to the things we already do. And that when somebody with a very different idea walks right in front of us, even if that idea could change our world, we are hesitant to thinking about what they know and how it might make us better. I can give you a real-world example that's particularly powerful. Any of you remember, it might not have been the most epic experience in your life, but any of you remember in the year 2010 participating in the United States Census? Okay, so some of you, it wasn't even less than epic. Okay. Well, if you had, you might have noticed that in 2010, the census, bless its heart, was done almost exactly the same way that it was done in 1790, the year of the first census, even though we have a little bit more advanced technology. Census takers came door to door with a clipboard and a form and a number 2 pencil and asked people how many people lived there, and a few other basic questions about them. And one might have imagined that there was a better, more high-tech way to do that. Well, in fact, there was. The Census Bureau spent $640 million, it's kind of real money, to create a handheld census taker. But at the end of 2008, when it was go time for the census taker, it simply did not work. And so that was scrapped, and an additional $3 billion they decided to go back to pen and paper. Now, fortunately, they didn't use a quill pen like in 1790, but it was roughly the same thing. Now, that's a kind of interesting thing. And I recall just after that decision was made giving a speech to a group of federal government CIOs who were lamenting the fact that it's hard to make big investments over a time frame because sometimes they don't work out. To which I said, well, sometimes it is, I understand that, but sometimes actually the answer to the problems we face walks right up in front of us every day. Sometimes it even drives up to our building. And they said, what do you mean by that? And I said, imagine this. Have you ever noticed these really stylish men and women coming to your office every day at the Census Bureau? People wearing really beautiful brown clothes. They said, oh yes, the UPS people. I said, exactly. And I said, did you ever notice what these people do? And they said, deliver packages. And I said, exactly. And I said, did you ever notice what they held in their hands after they dropped off the package? And they said, brown. I said, brown is their color, yes. A brown handheld computer. Exactly. And I said, did you ever imagine that the UPS handheld computer had every address in America? And they said, come to think of it, I bet it does. And I said, did it ever dawn on you that you could have asked these people if you could have borrowed their handheld computer just to do a little census work? Nope, never thought of it. And I said, why not? They'd solved your problem for you. And they said, exactly. Now, one might argue that in a government agency we get a certain amount of funding and we don't want to give it up and take over the UPS's kind of deal. But one might also imagine that most of us who think of ourselves as high-level IT professionals couldn't fathom the notion that men and women who have their names embroidered on their shirts would hold something that could solve their problem and might even be as smart as they were. The challenge for all of us is to believe that everybody on earth knows something that could matter to me, and whenever we have a challenge, to be open to reaching out and casting a wider net to find people who might have insight that would be way different than the insight I already have. 1912 ended, I'm actually trained as a geographer, and so one of the great kind of moments in geography was the quest to get to the South Pole. It's a quest that was actually really kind of, in a way, a pitched battle between two guys and their teams. You can't leave? I haven't signed your book. Okay, thanks for being here. It was a pitched battle against not only two guys and their teams, but two different views of the world. One was Robert Falcon Scott, a British naval officer trained in the finest of British educational institutions. Welcome, you've come all the way from Los Angeles to be here? Okay, Robert Falcon Scott was a believer in the power of science and the power of society. And when he decided to get to the South Pole, he asked all the leading scientists in Great Britain how he should do it. They had their ideas, but the reality was none of them had ever come close to the South Pole. But they did suggest some things to him, like really being true to what made Britain great. And through that advice, he made some interesting decisions. One of them was quite fascinating, and many of you might even have wondered if it was a brilliant idea. When challenged to think about what animals he would bring to the South Pole, he decided to bring horses, the most noble of British animals. They didn't last very long. He was competing against a guy named Roald Amundsen, not particularly high. Oh no. At least he landed on his feet. And he told me he was grateful it wasn't that cold here. Okay, but anyway. Amundsen was an explorer by nature, but someone curious about the world around him. When the thought of reaching the South Pole came to him, he decided that the only way he'd ever get there was to see if there were any people he could learn from who had some idea how to survive on the South Pole. And he found near the North Pole Inuits and asked them if he could live with them. Not for a week, not for a spring semester, but for 2 years. He literally lived with them for 2 years, studying everything they did, asking them every question he could imagine, seeing how they moved, how they sheltered, how they took care of their animals, and understanding how they would avoid illness and the fact that their dogs were way more important than they were. Now, it helped that he was Norwegian and he was a skier, but he also realized that everyone he brought along should know how to ski. Scott brought very few people who had ever been on skis to go to the South Pole. Well, long story short, or long story slightly less long, Amundsen arrived at the South Pole, planted the Norwegian flag, and then returned with his 5 men safely. Scott arrived 32 days later, saw the Norwegian flag. One might have imagined a few choice words that he said, and then left a journal and the remains of his entire party on the way back. Scott was hailed as a hero. He had fought the noble fight. He had done things that great and thoughtful people from Britain would do. Amundsen went back to exploring some more. And what struck me as I thought about that story was the notion that in Britain, the idea was that the world was filled with fascinating people that we might organize and study and put exhibits about in museums, but that we never believed we could learn from them. And what Amundsen knew was that I could learn from anyone on earth, even a person that had no formal education, if I understood what I wanted to accomplish, and I was willing to connect with them and be humble about what they and I knew. So when we think about the power of strangers, I think we simply need to think about that for all of us to unlock the real power of strangers, we need to be willing to do a few things that we can do but don't always do. First is we need to be curious. We need truly to be curious about the world around us. We need to truly believe that on this planet is so much wonderful wisdom and so many remarkable people with insights that at times are way better than my own. The second is we need to be humble. We need to be honest and open about the things that we simply do not know. The reality is most of us don't know most things, and yet most of us try to do things in areas in which there are people who could help us be way more successful. And the third is we need to truly always respect other people in their world for what they know. And I think one of the challenges I have working with lots of large organizations is getting them to be open to the fact that even when they've been successful, their success long term is going to be tied to being open to an awful lot of people who know a lot of new and different things. It's fascinating now to realize that many of the new drug discoveries are not happening in a lab in New Jersey, but they're happening because companies based in New Jersey or London or Gothenburg, Sweden, are actually sending people out to the most remote villages in the world and asking people how for thousands of years they've treated certain illnesses or cured certain diseases, and that those are becoming the basis for a whole new generation of drugs that all of us will be using. It's also interesting that the most American brand, Levi Strauss, a brand that's revered everywhere in the world for its denim and the American look, today, as we are here, has a team of people wandering the world, studying other people's clothing, studying their fabrics, studying their materials, studying how they dye clothing, studying how they wash clothing, studying how they make it as long-lasting as possible, studying how it holds up in different climates, and incorporating those ideas to make the most American brand a truly even more remarkable global brand. The reality is that the world is filled with powerful ideas, and we have the ability, if we're open to them, to be way more remarkable than we ever imagined. And if you don't want to get that far, I'd even argue that right around the corner you could find all kinds of cool ideas that might inspire new thinking on your part. If you're trying to figure out how to connect with the people that you serve in whatever you do better, you might actually hang out and pay attention as opposed to just spending money at Whole Foods. So how many of you regularly shop at Whole Foods? Okay, don't be embarrassed. Okay, and you do this because you like to spend twice as much for groceries as you should, right? Well, the reality is, you know, I can understand their business model. I can understand that there's a lot of fresh stuff there, that there's a lot of stuff that's natural and organic, which doesn't necessarily make it healthy. But I also understand that if I want people to spend that much, I better treat them really well, and I better drive a lot of knowledge. So if you paid attention at Whole Foods, other than quickly running in to get something, you notice a bunch of stuff goes on there. First, there are lots of brochures and printed material trying to make you smart about stuff. Second, there are classes that go on several nights a week in which they're willing to engage you and actually get you to kind of learn some new things. Third is they're willing to let you try this expensive stuff, you know? And so you try it and then you say, that's great. And they also, you know, bring in folks from small farms, so you want to try their stuff. That's really important. Then you get to the cash register, you find out how much it is, then you're in shock. But you still hang in there and buy it. Okay, so they let you try it. And then the fourth thing is that they actually commit to making their people really knowledgeable about the stuff they offer. So imagine you're a giant and you need a product. Let's say you need prune juice, okay? It's a fun product, okay? It's a happy product, prune juice, okay. So you ask somebody, a giant, where it is, and so they say, oh, I don't know, aisle 24, just go west, okay? If you ask somebody at Whole Foods where the prune juice is, they're required to take you there. Have you noticed that? And once they get you there, they're required to ask you, do you have any questions? To which you might say, I don't know, does it work? And if they don't know the answer, am I moving around too much? I apologize. If they don't know the answer, they're required to find a colleague who knows the answer. That's kind of cool. So we could kind of get a sense from them about how to educate and engage the folks we serve in kind of a compelling way. If you could tolerate the abuse and you wanted to learn another cool idea, you could go to IKEA or IKEA. And I really used to despise going to IKEA, but I'm compelled to going there because my wife's from Sweden and she has an insatiable appetite for marinated fish. You know, so IKEA, you know, you've all been to IKEA, yes? You can't avoid. So it's that giant blue and yellow kind of building, okay? And you notice that the employees there also wear bright blue and yellow clothes, right? And you're probably saying to yourself, they do that because those are the national colors of Sweden, right? I think they actually wear those clothes so they'll know who else in the store they're allowed to talk to. Each other, okay? Because they certainly don't want to talk to customers. So at IKEA, your job is to find it, you know? You walk through, and once you enter IKEA, you're condemned to walking past every one of the 10,000 products they sell before you're allowed to leave. So you find what you want. Then you wrestle it to the ground. Then you go through checkout, which is increasingly self-serve, because if they didn't want to talk to you in the store, why do they want to talk to you when you're leaving, okay? And then you get it out to your car and you go, no, I have no roof rack, it won't fit. That's okay, they have it covered. Because at IKEA, they have cardboard roof racks and string. So then you can just put it on your roof. If you ever see anybody leaving IKEA, don't drive behind them. Okay. Then you get it home and you open the instructions and they have no words because they're too cheap to give you words. No, they have this guy with a bubble head. And they use it in all 47 countries where they offer IKEA products. So you figure it out with this little wrench called an Allen wrench, not named after me. And then you put it together, and then you call your friends and say, I got new furniture, come on over. To which you open the door, the friends go, God, it's awesome. And you go, yes, but it's from IKEA, don't sit in it. So I used to really dislike these people, and then what I realized was they were trying to teach me a lesson, and that is that self-help matters, that I got to do it myself, that it's all about me at IKEA. Well, the reality is in all of our businesses and organizations, we need to understand the power of self-help because we have fewer resources to do a lot of stuff for people. We need to figure out how to do remarkable stuff for people with what they'll pay us and then empower them to get excited about doing the next set of stuff on their own. So there's that going on. If I wanted to learn about how to connect with young people and I didn't have young people living in my house, I might hang out at Urban Outfitters. Has anybody ever been there? It's a fascinatingly cool place. Cool music, cool stuff, a lot of retro stuff. And one fascinating thing that runs different than my world as I grew up. At Urban Outfitters, their customer service is to ignore you. Okay? Because they know their customers want to be left alone. They want to have their own experience in the store. And then if they have their own experience in the store, they're more likely to buy a lot of stuff and they'll come to you if they really, really need help. That has powerful implications for all of us as we're trying to grow and work with a younger workforce, is to understand how to engage people in powerful ways. I think I'm running out of time. So let me wrap up here because you probably have questions. I could talk. This is part of a 5-day presentation. And you didn't sign up for that. Okay. So let me end with a short story, and then I'll take any questions you have, and then I'll hang out here. God, I didn't even get to all my toys, but another time. 7 years ago, as I'm walking our middle daughter, Carly, to the bus, we passed a guy I'd never seen in our neighborhood before who, from my protective parental eyes, looked a little bit dangerous. He was kind of disheveled. He was talking to himself, and he was kind of walking and making quite unusual mannerisms. Once we got out of earshot of him, I turned to Carly and said, you know, sweetheart, Mama and Papa can't always walk you to the bus. So I want you to promise me that when we're not with you, you won't talk to strangers. It seemed like great advice in our less than perfect times, and it was advice my parents had gave me in much safer times, to which Carly looked up at me and said, but Papa, if I don't talk to strangers, how will I ever make new friends? And how will I ever learn new things? I'd like to challenge all of you with a little bit of caution to make strangers a bigger part of your life. To seek folks out there who might know something that you don't know, to regularly connect with people who are very different than you, and to understand how they see the world and what matters to them, and see if some of their perspective is really powerful for you. Each day we pass by 100 people who could change our lives, and yet we never take the time to notice them. The success of all of us in our organization will depend on how often we decide to connect and reach out to people who are different than us. So I'm delighted you're here. I hope this is of interest to you. I'll take questions, hang around, and thank you very much. Appreciate it.
That was really interesting, and I'm glad that I stayed. I've been here for a while. Thank you. And I'm sorry that you didn't get to the animal with the stethoscope, because I'm a physician. And what I was wondering is, would you apply your theory of the swimmers to the Affordable Health Care, the Affordable Care Act? Everybody in Europe, everybody else in the developed world does it essentially single payer with price controls. And when we went to reform health care, we decided to make our own system better. Would you consider that an example of what you described in the case of the swimmers?
Okay, no, so this is awesome. I mean, this could be another 5-day conversation that we could have. So So I believe you're absolutely right, but you know, I don't have a lot of political influence here. So you're absolutely right. There are a lot of places, if we wanted to create a healthcare system that provided access to everybody and affordable quality healthcare to everybody,
Exactly.
there are lots of places that actually have figured out how to do that. But we have a lot of issues about believing that those places are socialist, or it's a small country and what do they know, or they're all blonde, the people in that country. You know, so I have the privilege of going to Sweden every year, in which they have a healthcare system in which, while you might wait for a certain type of procedure, at 40% of the cost of our healthcare system, everybody is covered and people live 6 years longer than we do. So it is kind of interesting. It might get you to wonder, you know, whether or not there are other folks who know something we don't know. This is a great, I hate to kind of take too much time, but this is a cool story. So this is awesome. So the stethoscope, so,
Right.
so you might know this. So the stethoscope is awesome, and it's the most commonly used medical diagnostic device. It was invented in 1811 by a French surgeon. And it basically stayed, other than different materials, in the same form for about 196 years. And then some folks, a combination of 3M and Littman Company, decided that it could get a major overhaul because, unlike the Census Bureau, they knew there was technology that they could use. And so they created a stethoscope that simply had a small digital computer attached to it. So now imagine this, maybe less important to you, but imagine in a developing country. So imagine a primary care medical practitioner in the mountains of Bolivia or a small village in Africa or somewhere in Asia could actually be listening to the heart or lungs of a child, and then, as opposed to simply taking notes on the basic thing, could get a more in-depth picture, which they literally could then copy on this device, and then they could push a button and send it to a medical center somewhere in a big city where either a highly trained tech or a physician could look at that and decide whether or not that child or that other person needed to be brought in because they had a different kind of condition. Because somebody dared to believe that a 200-year-old device could actually be way more powerful and that it was essential to so many people on Earth. So there's so many cool things going on. Long-winded. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you for being here. There are no more questions? Okay. I'll keep talking then if there are no more.
Now, I have a question. What you describe about reaching out to strangers is sort of an individual act. And my question is, how does that extrapolate to an organization?
Perfect.
Because the organization may not have that same outlook.
Okay. So if the organization doesn't have that same outlook, we have a big challenge, okay? But I think what we have to think about first is more strategically, every organization needs to do a better job of tapping all of the talents of all of its people and figuring out how to create synergies among all of its people, because if it simply allows everybody to just stay in their group, then the likelihood is we're going to get fairly narrow kind of solutions to the challenges we face. So it's in the interest of every organization to regularly be asking people across the organization, how would you, from your different perspectives, be part of solving kind of a challenge that we face? Now that requires leaders to be open and understand that, or feel such pressure that they're just not doing well enough. Having said that, one of the things that I've done with a number of our customers, which starts to get at this, but again it involves leaders kind of being engaged, and it's written about in the book, is a really cool exercise that we don't have time to do, but maybe before you leave, do it with somebody else here. And it's what I call the power of 10 things. In organizations, what I challenge people to do is I challenge people to connect with somebody in a different part of the organization that they don't know at all, and I ask them to simply sit down and have a conversation with that person. Now the critical thing is that I ask them to have a conversation about nothing that has to do anything to do with work. So I ask them for 5 to 10 minutes to have a conversation with somebody else in the organization, and all they're allowed to do is find 10 things they have in common that have nothing to do with work. Now, that's a particularly simple and powerful thing because I know the answer to this. I've seen this movie before, and what I know is that I could place you with any other person on the planet, and if language wasn't an issue, even though you'd go, God, this is going to be an ordeal, you wouldn't necessarily do that. You'd find 10 things you had in common with that person, okay? So think about this, because this is a super cool idea. We tend quickly in organizations and in our lives and when we read the newspapers to basically make decisions about people based on how they're different than us. Okay? So we know about all the people in all the other corners of the world who are different than us, and why would I want to deal with them? They're a challenge. Well, the reality is that we are 99% alike. everyone on earth. We all laugh, we all cry, we all care about family, we all want to make a difference, we all want to try and get by. We're looking to figure out how to be centered and find happiness in life. So the reality is, if I can get people to see the similarity first, then suddenly it's hard to argue or battle with somebody who's a lot like me. And yet in organizations we begin with the differences, and then we never get to the similarities. But if we began with the similarities, then suddenly we'd be way more willing to come together with people who are very different than us to kind of work on things and change the way we do things and give up some of our stuff to make sure that overall the organization was more successful.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for being here.
Are there any last questions or?
Last questions.
Do one exercise.
Do one exercise. Well, we could do that. Well, I love that exercise, actually. I'm kind of keen on that, but I don't know. Do you have, Ingrid, do you have a question first, and then?
I did have.
And then we'll. Hey.
Thinking about your thoughts, but I've noticed there's a social phenomenon that people are really plugged up. They're wired. If you go to the gym, they're wired. If you're walking on the street, they're wired. You're in Starbucks, they're wired. In your home, they're wired.
I'll listen. Okay.
Everybody's wired. It's
Right.
interesting. So,
They-
and the airplane, you're flying.
Right.
Everybody's like wired. Not everybody, but certainly there's a social phenomenon that people are really
Oh, I think absolutely.
plugged up.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's sort of contrary.
We've got to break. We've got to be the ones that break that down. We've got to stop them, get them to take their earphones out.
Sure. Not an airplane, right? Yeah. No, it's sort of
Oh, come on. You can do that. I always get an aisle seat on an airplane, you know, because then, you know, I have the ability to talk about my latest book with more people, okay? Because the people between me and the window, they're captive. Actually, any bodily function they have, they need my permission to make it happen. Okay? And the person right across the way from me, you know, they're fair game, okay? And then if I happen to hear something interesting in the row in front of me or the row behind me, I have access to these people. People who think of themselves as more introverted in the room are going, oh my God, I'm going to die. This guy is nuts. Okay, but anyway. No, but I think you're right. So, you know, people are absolutely preoccupied. You know, remember, for those of you who've been in Washington for a while, remember when the Post did this piece and they took one of the world's greatest musicians, Joshua Bell, and they placed him at the LaFont Plaza metro station, okay? And they had him play for 43 minutes 6 of the greatest pieces ever written for violin. He played them on a violin he had just purchased or taken out a loan for that cost $3.2 million. 1,100 people walked by him, 21 stopped for any time at all. 21 stopped for he got $32 were donated to him. That's kind of a misnomer because one woman gave $20 because she knew he was brilliant and she had a rough idea who he was. And then she said, God, I knew he didn't even need the money probably because the next night he was playing at the Kennedy Center for $100,000. But people walked by. More people went to buy their lottery ticket across the hallway there than actually stopped to listen to remarkable music. So we tune out and we don't have an appreciation for a world of remarkable things around us. Now that's an extreme example, but there's remarkable stuff going on. And I see all these people who are wearing their earphones and they walk by in Washington some of the greatest museums in America. A place where if instead of listening to the same song they've listened to 1,000 times, they could walk in and just on their lunch break spend 20 or 30 minutes going through an exhibit and thinking about how artists might view the world that could dramatically kind of change their view of how to make things happen. So we've got to change it, and I'm suggesting we start with all of you here first. Okay.
Okay, I want to give my comment. Since it was already brought up, I started at HHS a week before Affordable Care Act rolled out. And I came in to basically clean up a program. And I can't tell you how many times people said they do things a certain way because that's the way they do it. And I've been there now almost about 6 months, and it's unbelievable how resistant people are to change. Having said that, I'm also a lawyer, and
that makes you really open to change.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to say. That everything's based on precedent, and you have to have authority for everything you do. But the other thing is that there's the issue of copyright and patent infringement if we borrow from other sources, then without giving them proper attribution or get permissions.
Okay, but we're allowed to give people attribution, right?
Right, and permission.
Right. So we can do that. So we can borrow, you know, as long as we give people credit. I think we can borrow. I think we can do that. But I think your other point is interesting, and I'd love you people to think about, you know, in all of your organizations, not only are we set in our ways, but we create a perpetuating kind of system for being set in our ways. And we do that through an amazing invention of human resources called orientation, okay? So when we enter a new organization, we have orientation, and orientation is awesome. Because within a short amount of time, what we're going to do is teach people exactly how we do things in our organization so they can be fine, upstanding members and do it exactly the same way we've always done it, which is kind of an interesting idea. The reality is the newest person in our organization, the day they arrive, is the most innovative person there because they've been somewhere else and they still remember that other place. Why wouldn't we, when somebody arrives, say to them, you know, we do have an orientation, and if you'd like it, you can have it. But for the next week or two, what we'd like you to do is wander around, talking to everybody, going to meetings, hanging out, looking at how we do things, and then telling us what things you think we do really well, and in what ways you think we're absolutely clueless, before we suck the brain right out of you too.
Right. Well, I mean that, and you know, I had a little conversation with you earlier on that. It's not just in the organization; it's in our whole education system, where kids come in and you ask a kindergartner who's an artist, and they're all very creative, and we suck out the creativity of them as we train them for, you know, kind of multiple choice testing for the SAT. So it's not just that. And then our organizations that are now doing this reverse mentoring, where the youngest people are, you know, mentoring the oldest people in the organization, coming in like that. I don't know, could you make some comments on the education system generally for people entering the workforce and what we can be doing better?
Well, so I actually today, so I came up with this idea. So today I blogged about something related to this. You know, and I was on college tours with our daughter Carly, and two things struck me. The first was that we ought to require every high school graduate to take a year off and not go to college and actually kind of engage and explore the world around them. We simply ought to do that. That way they're way more likely when they arrive to have a better sense of how this might fit or how they can use education to make a difference in the world. The second is we ought to require, if we actually believe that we're all global citizens and we're part of a broader world, even though only 21% of Americans have passports, then we should require that every college student spend at least a semester in another country and another culture. And we ought to do that with the idea that we want to challenge them to be curious and humble and respectful of other people and other ways of thinking of doing things. And then I think what we want is to basically kind of teach people to not be wedded to a single discipline. So that's the challenge. You know, the first thing they pressure you to do in college is find a major, okay? And then once you find a major, you take all these foundational courses of how you think in that major, because that's the best way to master that major's version of the breaststroke, okay? When the reality is, certainly a major is okay, but more importantly is an openness to the way other people think, the way other disciplines think, the way people think in other cultures. And I think we don't do a particularly good job of that at most places. But at the University of Maryland, where you are, I think you're doing great.
Okay. You know, we really are working on having everybody have some touch to international. But there's always proxies for that. And we talked about Wired and, you know, LinkedIn. You know, and the whole Kevin Bacon effect of that is that, you know, it's not your friends that are important, it's your friends of your friends of your friends that you can get contact to. And things like TED Talks and, you know, the world of video gives you some proxy to international exposure.
If you're open to that.
If you're open
to
the openness,
listening to different things, reading different things, exploring the ideas of different people, then you get that. But do we as a society encourage people to do that? Or are we a society that encourages people to specialize to the extent that they miss a bunch of this other? I don't know.
Universities were not a great place for non-specialization for a long time.
All right.
Okay. Have we run out of time?
Questions. We are pretty much out of time. But if you